Well, good evening, everyone. You're all here for a good reason, like I am. We're going to enjoy this fire, and we're going to have us some good coffee and maybe something to snack on. And in the meantime, we're going to say hi to our friends, and we're going to tell stories. And tonight, I'm reading some more of the book 3 of the Untamed series, The Seventh Man by Max Brand. We're going to do chapter 19 through 21 tonight. I'm thinking that's going to be some good story. We got the daughter running with the wolf dog, and who knows what's going to happen. So let's get started. It's The Venture, chapter 19. From the moment Joan gave the name of Daddy Dan, the wolf dog kept to the trail with arrowy straightness. Whatever the limitations of Bart's rather uncanny intelligence, upon one point he was usually letter perfect. And even when a stranger mentioned Dan within the hearing of the dog, it usually brought a whine or at least an anxious look. He hewed to his line now with that animal sense of direction which men can never wholly understand. Boulders and trees slipped away on either side of Joan, and now on a descent of the mountainside he broke into a lope that sent the flowers fluttering on her bonnet. Now he prowled up the ravine beyond, utterly tireless. He was strictly business. When she slipped a little from her place as he veered around a rock, he didn't slow up as usual that she might regain her seat, but he switched his head back with a growl that warned her back into position. That surprise was hardly out of her mind when she saw a gay patch of wild flowers a little from the line of his direction, and she tugged at his ear to swing him towards it. A sharp jerk of his head tossed her hand aside, and again she caught that glint of wild eyes as he looked back at her. Then she grew grave, puzzled. She trusted Black Bart with all of her heart, as only a child can trust dumb animals. But now she sensed a change in him. She had guessed at a difference on that night when Dan came home for the last time. The same thing seemed to be in that dog today. Before she could make up her mind as to what it might be, Black Bart swung aside up a steep slope and whisked her into the gloom of a cave. Into the very heart of the darkness he glided, and he stopped. "Daddy Dan," she called. A faint echo after a moment came back to her from the depths of the cave, making her voice strangely deep. Otherwise there was no answer. "Bart," she whispered, suddenly frightened by the last murmur of that echo. "Daddy Dan's not here. Let's go back." She tugged at his ear to turn him, but again that jerk of the head freed his ear. He caught her by the cloak, crouched close to the floor, and she found herself all at once sitting on the gravelly floor of the cave with Bart facing her. "Bad Bart," she said, scrambling to her feet. "Naughty dog." She was still afraid to raise her voice in that awful silence and in the dark. When she glanced around her, she made out vague forms through the dimness that might be the uneven walls of the cave, or might be strange and awful forms of night. "Take me home." A growl that went shuddering down the cave stopped her, and now she saw that the eyes of Bart glowed green and yellow. Even then she could not believe that he would harm her, and stretched out a tentative hand. This time she made out the flash of his teeth as he snarled. He was no longer the Bart she had played with around the cabin, but a strange wild thing. And with a scream she darted past him towards the door. Never had those chubby legs flown so fast. But even as the light from the mouth of the cave glimmered around her, she heard a crunching on the gravel from behind, and then a hand, it seemed, caught her cloak and jerked her to a stop. She fell sprawling, head over heels, and when she looked up, there sat Bart upon his haunches above her, growling terribly and gripping the end of the cloak. No doubt about it now. Black Bart would have his teeth in her throat if she'd made another movement towards that entrance. A city child would have either gone mad with terror or else made that fatal struggle to reach the forbidden place. But Joan had learned many things among the mountains, and among others, she knew the difference between the tame and the free. The old dapple cow was tame, for instance, And the Maltese cat, which came too close to Bart the year before and received a broken back for its carelessness, had been tame. And the brown horse with the white face and the dreary eyes, it was tame. They could be handled and teased and petted and bossed about at will. Other creatures were different. For instance, the scream of the hawk always made her shrink a little closer to the ground, or else run helter-skelter for the house. And sometimes, up the gulches, she even heard the wailing of a mountain lion on the trail, hunting swiftly and very hungry. There was even something about the dead eyes of certain lynxes and coyotes and bobcats, which Daddy Dan trapped, that made Joan feel these animals belonged to a world where the authority of man was only the strength of his hand or his cunning. Not that she phrased these thoughts in definite words, but Joan was very close to nature. Therefore, her instincts gave her a weird little touch of wisdom in such matters. And when she lay there tangled in her cloak and looked up into the glowing eyes of Bart, heard his snarling roll around her and pass into creepy chills up her back, she nearly died of fear, to be sure. But she lay as still, frozen into a part of the rock. Black Bart was gone, and in his place was a terrible creature which belonged there among the shadows, for it could see in the night. Presently the bright eyes disappeared, and now she saw that Bart lay stretched across the entrance to the cave, where the long shadow was now creeping down the slope. Inches by inches she ventured to sit up, and all it brought from Bart was a quick turn of the head and a warning growl. It meant as plainly as though he had spoken it in so many words, "Stay where you are, and I don't care in the least what you do. But don't try to cross this entrance if you fear the length of my teeth and the keenness thereof." And she did fear them, very much, for she remembered the gashes across the back and the terrible rips up the side of the dead Maltese cat. She even took a little heart after a time. A grown-up cannot feel terror or grief as keenly as a child, but neither does terror or grief pass away a tithe as fast. She seemed at liberty to roam about in the cave as long as she did not go near the entrance. And now the shadows and the dimness no longer frightened her. Nothing was terrible except that long, dark body which lay across the entrance to the cave. She finally got to her feet and began to explore about her. She came first on a quantity of dead grass heaped in a corner. That was where Satan was stalled, no doubt, and it made all the cave seem almost homelike. She found, too, a number of stones grouped together with ashes in the hollow circle that was where the fires were built. And there to the side lay a pile of dead wood. A little down the cave and directly in the center of the top, she next saw the natural aperture where the smoke must escape. And last of all, she came on the bed. Boughs heaped a foot thick with the blankets on top, neatly stretched out, and the tarpaulin over all, made a couch as soft as down and fragrant with the pure scent of evergreens. Joan tried the surface with a foot that sank to her ankle, and then with her hands, and finally sat down to think. The first fear was almost gone. She understood that Bart was keeping her here until Dan came home, and fear does not go hand in hand with understanding. She only wondered now at the reason that Daddy Dan kept living in this cave so far from the warm comfort of the cabin, and so far away from her mother. But thinking makes small heads drowsy, and in 5 minutes Joan lay with her head pillowed on her arm, sound asleep. When she awoke, the evening gray of the cave had given place to utter blackness, alarming and thick. Joan sat up with a start. She would have cried out, bewildered, but now she heard a noise on the gravel, and turned to see Daddy Dan entering the cave with Satan behind him, quite distinctly outlined by the sunset outside. Black Bart walked first, looking back over his shoulder, as though he led the way. It was partly because the black, silhouetted figures awed her somewhat, and partly because she wished to give Daddy Dan a gay surprise that Joan did not run to him. And then, in the darkness, she heard Satan munching the dried grass, and the squeak and rattle as the saddle was drawn off and hung up, scraping against the rock. "What you been doing, Bart?" queried the voice of Daddy Dan. and the last of Joan's fears fell from her as she listened. "You act kind of worried. If you've been running rabbits all day and you got your pads full of thorns, I'll everlastingly treat you rough," the wolf dog whined. "Well, speak up. What do you want? You want me over there?" It would have been a trifle unearthly to most people, but Joan knew the ways of Daddy Dan with Satan and Black Bart. She lay quite still, shivering with pleasure as the footsteps approached her. Then a match scratched, and she saw by the blue burst of flame that he was lighting a pine torch, then whirling it until the flame ate down to the pitchy knot. He held it above his head, and now she saw him plainly. The light cascaded over his shoulders, glowed on his eyes, and then puffed out sideways in a draught. Jo was upon her feet and running towards him with a cry of joy, until she remembered that he was not to be approached like her mother. There was never any bear hugs from him, no caresses, not much laughter. She stopped barely in time and stood with her fingers interlaced, staring up at him, half delighted, half afraid. She read his mind by microscopic changes in his eyes and his lips. "Munner sent me." That was wrong, she saw at once. "And Bart brought me. Much better now. And oh, Daddy Dan, I've been lonesome for you." He continued to stare at her for another moment, and even Joan could not tell whether he was angry or indifferent or pleased. "Well," he murmured at length, "I guess you're hungry, Joan." She knew it was complete acceptance, and she could hardly keep from a shout of happiness. Daddy Dan had a great aversion to sudden outcries. "I guess I am," said Joan. Chapter 20, Discipline. He made the preparation for summer with such easy speed that everything seemed to be done by magic hands. When Joan's mother cooked supper, there was always much rattling of the stove and the building of the fire, a long preparation of food, and another interval when things steamed and sizzled on the fire. There following the setting of the table, and then a long aching time of hunger when the food was in sight, but one could not eat until Daddy Dan had done this and Munner had done that. Also, when one did eat, half the taste was taken from things by the necessity of various complicated evolutions of knife and fork. Instance the absurdity of taking the fork under the thumb, with the forefinger pressing along the back of that wobbly instrument, when anyone could see the proper natural way of using a fork was to grasp it dagger-wise and drive it firmly through that skidding piece of meat. Not only this, but a cut must be held in one hand, and bread must be broken into little pieces before putting butter on it. Above all, no matter how terribly hard one tried, there was sure to be a mistake, and then, "Now, Joan, don't do this. This is the way." But how different everything was in this delightful house of Daddy Dan. In an incredibly short time, 3 torches flared about them and filled the air with scents of freshness and the outdoor scents that went tingling up the nose and filled one with immense possibilities of eating. At the very same time, a few motions caused a heap of wood to catch fire and blaze among the stones, while a steady stream of blue-white smoke wavered up towards the top of the cave and disappeared in the shadows. After this, her father showed her a little stream of water which must come from a spring far back in the cave, and the current slipped noisily along one wall and dipped out of sight again before it reached the entrance to the place. Here she discovered a little bowl, made out of small stones nicely fitted together, and allowing the water to pour over one edge and out at another, with a delicious purling, such crystal clear water that one actually wanted to wash in it, even if it was cold, and even if one had that many sore places on fingers and nose and behind the ears. Behold, no sooner did one turn from the washing of hands and face than the table was miraculously spread upon the surface of a flat rock, with other stones nearby to serve as chairs, and on the table steamed pone, warmed over, coffee with milk in it, coffee which was so strictly banned at home, potatoes sliced to transparent thinness and fried to crisp brown at the edges, and a great slab of meat that fairly shouted to the appetite. So far, so good, but the realization was 1,000-fold better than the anticipation. No cutting of one's own meat at this enchanted board. The shining knife of Daddy Dan divided it into delectable bits with the speed of light, and it needed only the slightest amount of experimenting and cautious glances to discover that one could use a fork dagger-wise, and when in doubt, even seize upon a morsel with one's fingers and wipe the fingers afterwards on a bit of dry grass. One could grasp the cup by both sides, scorning that silly handle, and if occasionally one sipped the coffee with a little noise, which added astonishingly to the taste, there was no sharp warning, no frowning eye to overlook. Besides, at Munner's table there was never time to pay attention to Joan, for there was talk about vague, abstract things, the price of skins, the melting of the snows, the condition of the passes, and the long and troubling argument about the wicker chairs, with some remarkably foolish asides, now and then, concerning happiness and love, when all the time anyone with a half an eye could see that the thing to do was eat and eat and eat until that hollow place ceased to be. Talking came afterwards. Well, in the house of Daddy Dan, all these things were ordered as they should be. Not a word was said. Not a glance of criticism rested upon her. When her tin plate was cleared, she heard no reproofs for eating too greedily. But now she was furnished anew from the store of good things on the rock. In place of conversation, there were other matters to occupy the mind during the meal, for presently she observed the beautiful head of Satan just behind his master. Satan, who could pass over noisy gravel with the softness of a cat, and now loomed out of the deeper night down the cavern, inch by inch, with infinite caution and keenly pricked ears, the head lowered beside Dan, and the quivering, delicate muzzle stole towards a fragment of the pone. Joan watched breathlessly, and then she saw that in spite of the caution of that movement, her father knew all about it, just a glint of amusement in the corner of his eyes, just a slight twitch at the corner of his mouth to tell Joan that he was as delighted as a boy playing a trick. Barely in time to save that morsel of pone, he spoke, and the head was dashed up. Yet Satan was not entirely discouraged. If he could not steal the bread, he would beg for it. It made Joan pause in her destruction of the edibles, not to watch openly, for an instant told her that the thing to do was to note these play-by-plays from the corner of one's eye, as Daddy Dan did, and swallow the ripples of mirth that came tickling in the throat. She knew perfectly well that Satan would have it in the end, for all living things, not even Munner had such power over Dan as that black stallion. He maneuvered adroitly. First he circled the table and stood opposite the master, begging with his eyes. But Dan looked fixedly down at the rock until an impatient whinny called up his eyes. Then he pretended the most absolute silence. "Why, Satan, you old scoundrel, what are you doing over there? Get back where you belong." He gestured with a thumb over his shoulder, and Satan glided around the rock and stood once more behind Dan. "Manners," continued Dan, "you ain't got 'em. You'll be trying to sit down at the table with me pretty soon," he concluded. "But I'll teach you one of these days, and you'll smart for a week." Even at the mock menace, Joan trembled a little, but to her astonishment, Satan paid not the slightest heed. Dan sat with his hat on his head, which was a new and delightful event at the table, and now the stallion took the hat by the crown dexterously and raised it just an inch and put it back in place. Black Bart, having crept out of the shadows, sat down near Joan with his long red tongue lolling out. This procedure called a growl from him, but the master continued eating without the slightest interest, apparently, in Satan's insolence. A velvety muzzle appeared, and the chin resting on the shoulder of Dan into the great luminous eyes above. He whinnied so softly that it was not more than a human whisper, and meant almost as much. "Oh," said Dan, and all seeming just roused to attention. "You hungry, old boy?" He raised the morsel of pone between the thumb and the forefinger, holding it tightly. Then it was a joy to watch Satan. He tried to tug it all away at once, but only a fragment broke off. He stamped in impatience and then went to work to nibble the bread away on all sides of Dan's fingers. Very fine work for such broad, keen chisels as Satan's teeth, but he went about it with the skill of long practice, turning his head this way and that, and always watching the face of the master with sideways eyes, one ear forward, one ear back. Finally, the tight fingers opened out, and Satan gathered the last crumbs from the smooth palm. 2 or 3 times during this performance, Black Bart had half risen from his haunches, and a growl swelled almost inaudibly in his throat. But now he stalked around the table and pushed his narrow head between Dan's shoulder and the stallion. A snarl of incredible ferocity made Satan turn, but without the slightest dread, apparently. For an instant, the two stood nose to nose, Black Bart a picture of snarling danger, and Satan with curiosity, pricking ears, and bright eyes. The growling rose toward a crescendo, a terrible sound. Then a lean hand shot out, with that speed which Joan could never comprehend, and which always made her think, rather breathlessly, as of the strike of a snake. The fingers settled around the muzzle of Bart. "Of all the no-good hound dogs," declared Dan, "you're the worst, and the most jealousest. Lie down." Bart obeyed slowly, but his evil eyes were fixed upwards upon the head of Satan. "Have you got any manners?" remarked Dan. "You'll be saying that you're sorry." The ears flattened along that snaky head. Otherwise, no answer. "Sorry," repeated the master. Out of the deep throat of Black Bart, infinitely ludicrously small, came a whine which was more dog-like than anything Joan had ever heard before from the wolf. "Now," continued the implacable master, "you go over in that corner and you lie down." Black Bart rose with a finally ugly look for Satan, and sneaked with a hanging head and tail to the outer edge of the circle of light. "Farther, clear over there in the dark," came the order, and Bart had to uncoil himself again in the very act of lying down and retreat, with another ominous growl clear into the darkness. Satan held his head high and watched triumphantly. But Joan felt that this was a little hard on Bart. She wanted to run over and comfort him, but she knew from of old that it was dangerous to interfere where Daddy Dan was disciplining either horse or wolf. Besides, she was not quite free from her new awe for Bart. "All right," said the master presently, without raising his voice. It brought a dark thunderbolt rushing into the circle of the light, and stopping at Dan's side with such suddenness that his paws slid in the gravel. And there he stood, actually wagging his bushy tail, an unprecedented outburst of joy for Bart, and staring hungrily into the face of Dan. She saw a wonderful softening in the eyes of her father as he looked at the great dangerous beast. "You ain't a bad sort," he said, "but you need putting in place continual." Black Bart whined agreement. After that, when the dishes were being cleared away and cleaned with a speed fully as marvelous as the preparation of supper, Joan remembered with a guilty start the message which she should have given to Daddy Dan, and she brought out the paper much rumpled. He stood by the fire to read the letter. "Dan, come back to us. The house is empty. There's no sign of you except your clothes and the skins you left drying in the vacant room. Joan sits all day mourning for you, and my heart is breaking. Oh, Dan, I don't grieve so much for what has been done, but I tremble for what you may do in the future." With the letter still in his hand, Dan walked thoughtfully to Satan and took the fine head between his fingers. "Suppose some gent was to drop you, Satan," he murmured. "Suppose he was to plug you whilst you were doing your best and take me where I want to go. Suppose he shot you not for anything you done, but because of something agin me. And suppose after killing you he was to sneak up on me with a lot of other gents and try to murder me before I had a chance to fight back. Satan, wouldn't I be right to trail 'em and kill 'em one by one? Wouldn't it?" Joan heard a very little of the words, only a soft murmur of anxiety, and she saw that Daddy Dan was very thoughtful indeed. The stallion reached for the brim of Dan's hat. It was withdrawn from his reach. His head bowed like the nod of assent. "Why, even Satan can see I'm right," murmured Dan. And moving back to the fire, he tore that letter into many pieces which fluttered down in a white stream and made the blaze leap up. Chapter 21, The Acid Test. Mrs. Johnny Somers managed to preserve her dignity while she escorted the visitor into the front room, and even while she asked him to sit down and wait. But once she had closed the door behind her, she cast dignity far away and did 2 steps at a time going upstairs. The result was that she reached the room of Betty Neal entirely out of breath. 200 pounds of fat, good-natured widowhood did not go with speed. She tossed open the door without any preliminary knock and stood there very red with a clearly defined circle of white in the center of each cheek. For a moment there was no sound except her panting and Betty Neal staring wildly at her from above her book. "He's come," gasped Mrs. Somers. "Who?" "Him." As if this odd explanation made everything clear, Betty Neal sprung from her chair, and she grew so pale that every freckle stood out. "Him?" she echoed ungrammatically. Then, "Where is he? Let me downstairs." But the widow closed the door swiftly behind her and leaned her comfortable bulk against it. "You ain't going," she asserted. "You ain't going. Leastways not until you got time to think it over." "I haven't time to think. That was the way with me," nodded Mrs. Somers when her eyes were tragic. "I went ahead and married Johnny in spite of everything, and look at me now, a widder. No, I ain't sorry for myself, 'cause I was a fool." "Mrs. Somers," said Betty, "will you please step out of my way?" "Honey, for heaven's sake, think a minute before you go down and face that man. He's dangerous. When I opened the door and seen him, I tell you the shivers went up my back." "Is he thin? Is he pale?" cried Betty Neal. "How did he get away? Did he escape? Did they parole him? Did they pardon him? Did he—" "Let me get down," she cried. Mrs. Somers flung away from the door. "Then go and marry your man-killer." But Betty Neal was already clattering down the stairs. Halfway to the bottom, her strength and courage ebbed suddenly from her, and she went on with short steps. And when at last she closed the parlor door behind her, she was staring as if she looked at a ghost. Yet Vic Gregg was not greatly changed, a little thinner perhaps, and just now he certainly did not have his usual color. The moment she appeared, he jumped to his feet as if he'd heard a shot, and now he stood with his feet braced a little to meet a shock, one hand twitching and playing nervously with the embroidered cloth on the table. She did not speak, merely stood with her fingers still gripping the handle of the door as if she were ready to dart away at the first alarm. A wave of pain went over the face of Vic Gregg, and remained looking at her out of his eyes, for all that his single-track concentrated mind could perceive in her was the thing he took for fear. "Miss Neal," he said. His voice shook, straightened out again. He made her think of one of her big schoolboys who had forgotten his lesson and now stood cudgeling his memory and dreading that terrible nightmare of staying after school. She had a wild desire to laugh. "Miss Neal, I ain't here to try to take up things that can't be took up again." Apparently he had prepared his speech carefully, and now he went on with more ease. "I'm leaving these here parts for some places unknown. Before I go, I just want to say I know I was wrong from the beginning. All I want to say is that I was just all sort of tied up in a knot inside, and when I seen you with him—" He stopped. "I hope you marry some gent that's worth you, only they ain't any such, and I want to wish you good luck, and say goodbye." He swept the perspiration from his forehead, caught up his hat. He had been through the 7th circle of torture. "Oh, Vic, dear," cried a voice he had never heard before. Then a flurry of skirts, then arms about him, then tears and laughter and eyes which went hungrily over his face. I've been a hound dog. My God, Betty, you don't mean that I love you, Vic? I never knew what it was to love you before. After I've been a man-killing, lying, sneaking... Don't you say another word, Vic. It was all my fault. It wasn't. It was mine. But if you'd only kind of held off a little and gone easy with me, you didn't give me a chance. When I looked back from the road, you wasn't standing in the door. I was, and you didn't look back. I did. Vic Gregg, are you trying to... But his anger fled from her as suddenly as it came. I don't care. I take all the blame. Well, I don't want you to. I won't let you. At that, she laughed hysterically. Vic, tell me that you're free. I'm paroled. Thank God. Oh, I've prayed and I've prayed. Vic, don't talk. Sit down there. So, I just want to look at you. There's a hollow, hungry place in me that's filling up again. It was Pete Glass, said Gregg brokenly. He trusted me clean through when the rest was looking at me like I was a snake. Pete got word to the governor, and there followed a long interval of talk that meant nothing, and then as the afternoon waned towards evening and the evening towards dark, he told her the whole story of the long adventure. He left out nothing, not a detail that might tell against him. When he came to the moment when Glass persuaded him to go back and betray Barry, he winced. But he set his jaw and plunged ahead. She, too, paled when she heard that, and for a moment she had to cover her eyes. But she was older by half a lifetime than she had been when he was last with her, and now she read below the surface. Besides, Vic had offered to undo what he had done, had offered to stay and fight for Barry, and surely that evened the score. There was a light rap on the door, then Mrs. Summers came in with a tray. Maybe you young folks forgot about supper, she said. I just thought I'd bring in a bite for you. She placed it on the table and then lingered, delighted, while her eyes went over them together and one by one. Perhaps Betty Neal was a fool for throwing herself away on a gunfighter, but at least Mrs. Summers was furnished with a story which half of Alder would know by tomorrow. The walls of her house were not soundproof. Besides, Mrs. Summers had remarkably keen ears. They've been a gentleman here ask for you, Vic, she said, but I thought maybe you wouldn't like it much to be disturbed, so I told him you wasn't here. Her smile fairly glowed with triumph. Thanks, said Gregg, but who was he? I ain't never seen him before. Anyway, it didn't much matter. He wanted to see some of the rest of the boys quite bad. Pete Glass and Ronicky Joe, and Sliver Waldron, Gus Reeve. He seemed to want to see 'em all real particular bad. Pete Glass and Ronicky and the posse, murmured Vic. He grew thoughtful. He wanted to see me, too? Very particular, and he seemed kind of downhearted when he found that Pete was out of town. He wanted to know when he might be back. What sort of looking gent was he? Asked Vic, and his voice was sharp. Him? Oh, he looked like a tenderfoot to me. Terrible polite, though, and he had a voice that wasn't hardly rougher than a girl's. Seemed like he was sort of embarrassed just talking to me. She smiled at the thought. But Gregg was on his feet now, his hands on the shoulders of Miss Summers as though he would try to shake information from her loose bulk. Look quick now, he said. Where did you send him? How you talk. Why, where should I send him? I told him like as not Ronicky and Sliver and Gus would be down to Lorimer's. The groan of Vic made her stop with a gasp. What did he look like? Mrs. Summers was very sober. Her smile congealed. Black hair, and young, and good-looking, and brown eyes, and... God! Vic, cried Betty Neal, what is it? She looked around her in terror. It's Barry! He turned toward the door, then stopped, in an agony of indecision. Betty Neal was before him, blocking the way with her arms outstretched. Vic, you shan't go. You shan't go. You've told me yourself that he's sure death. God knows he is. You won't go, Vic. But the others, Ronicky, Gus, she stammered in her fear. That's their lookout. There's 3 to 1. Let them kill. But they don't know him. They've never been close enough to see his face. Besides, no 3 men... For God's sake, tell me what to do. Stay here if you love me. I won't let you go. I won't. I got to warn him. You'll be killed. He tore away from her hands. I got to warn him, but who'll I help? Them three against Dan? He saved me twice. But I got to go. If you fight for him first, he'll only return on you afterwards, Vic. Stay here. What good's my life? What good's it if I'm a yaller dog again? I'm going out and be a man. Well, how's that? It got us down the road a little bit. Always some adventure in this here story. So somebody else got a story? Stand up and let's hear it. Yeah, there's one over in the corner. Well, listen, my story's over, so I'm heading on down. And I'll chat with y'all soon. Maybe tomorrow night. We're always here at this campfire. Until then, be good. This is Clay Steele. Good night.